Play through the pain. No. Well done. Good morning. How are you? That was not enthusiastic at all. Okay. Just assume it's a bad day for everyone. Sorry. It's good to be with you this morning. Obviously, I am not Pete. I'm Sam, if I haven't met you already. Like Dar said, Pete is down celebrating in Disneyland. So hopefully he's doing something cool this morning, like, having brunch, whatever Disneyland version of brunch is, like mimosas with Mickey or something along those lines. So I thought of that this morning in the shower, and I was like, oh, I hope that's not taken so that, I can pitch that to Disney. But yeah, it's good to be with you this morning. We are continuing on in a series we've been in since Easter, looking at resurrection and looking at these experiences that people had of a resurrected Jesus and seeing what it means for us to experience resurrection today. And so last week, Pete wrapped up this sort of chunk that we were in the last chapter of John. And so we are going to kind of forge ahead and move into the book of Acts this morning. One quick note, I changed up the title. It's called The Direction of Resurrection. If you're looking at the notes in your bulletin, it's called something else. Dar had to put up with my shenanigans of changing the title last minute, so props to Dar for that. But it doesn't really matter. It's not like you're going to run around and quote the title. But anyway, just wanted to clear that up. Before we get into Acts, though, I want to tell you about a time or multiple times, that I got geographically lost. So I assume most of you all, when you answer that question, you've all been lost at some point geographically, maybe metaphorically as well, but that's a little deeper than we're going to go today. But there was this sort of season in life where I tended to get lost quite a bit. And it started with an aversion to technology. So a lot of guys have this sort of I love the newest and greatest technology. I don't have that in me. I actually like to I had non-smartphones for a really long time. And so dumb phones, if you will. And just finally got a smartphone 2 or 3 years ago. But Kaylin, my wife, was more of an early adapter of smartphones. And so she got one pretty early on when we were living in Los Angeles, early on in our marriage. And she loved all the cool features of it. She loved the little map feature, which would tell you where to go. The thing was, I did not love the map feature. Because while I don't have that manly, I need the latest technology, I do have that sort of cultural manliness, I need to know where I'm going, and I want to just use my intuition and my Boy Scout skills, even though I wasn't a Boy Scout, to get there. And so we would have these, I wouldn't call them conflicts, but we'd be going somewhere in Los Angeles, which is a very large and complicated city, and I wanted to just figure my way out there, it's generally west, we're going to find it. And Kaylin had her smartphone, and she could type the address in and get there no problem. So what we ended up doing was I would try to get there on my own, and she would have the address pulled up with directions, and I'd be like, don't tell me how to get there. And she would watch me sort of meander around the city and take us into neighborhoods we didn't want to go in and all this sort of stuff. And watch the numbers, when it says you have 15 minutes to your destination, go up instead of go down. So you have 20 minutes now to your destination. And she was always very gracious about it, but generally she would eventually get to the point where either I would give up or she'd get so frustrated with my arrogance and stupidity that she'd be like, you're going the wrong direction, you need to turn around and go back to where we're going. And so eventually we would get there, but this happened over and over and over again. And I finally came around, I finally sucked it up and allowed her to tell me how to get places. But it caused some frustration, mainly on my part, because I was frustrating her with my own sort of arrogance. I tell you that because if you've ever felt spiritual frustration or frustration with life and God, if you've been frustrated because you haven't experienced the sort of resurrection that we've been talking about, it might be a similar issue. You might be going sort of the wrong direction or looking the wrong direction for God and for resurrection. So I want us to look at the story today in Acts 1, and I want us to look at the direction of resurrection. Because I think when we are looking in the right direction, the right way, we begin to see God in resurrection in new ways. And I think the story we're going to look at is going to help sort of turn us there. So we're going to check it out. Before we actually look at the text this morning, let me give you sort of the 5-verse summary that we missed. We're going to look at Acts 1, 6 through 11. First 5 verses are sort of just like an intro. And what it says is the resurrected Jesus was around with his followers for like 40 days. So they got 40 days of resurrected Jesus, which is pretty cool. And then he says to them, you're about to be baptized with the Holy Spirit. And this is their response where we pick up here. They say this, as a result, those who had gathered together asked Jesus, Lord, are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel now? Jesus replied, it isn't for you to know the times or seasons that the Father has set by his own authority. Rather, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. And you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. After Jesus said these things, as they were watching, he was lifted up and a cloud took him out of their sight. While he was going away and as they were staring towards heaven, suddenly 2 men in white robes stood next to them. They said, Galileans, why are you standing here looking towards heaven? This Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way that he saw you go into heaven. So, interesting story, kind of strange story. But I think what's happening here is these followers of Jesus are looking in the wrong direction and they're asking, sort of put it in a mean way, they're asking dumb questions of Jesus. And I'm going to sort of pick on them a little bit. I'm going to pick on these early followers. But it's not because I actually think that they're dumb people. I think it's because this story is trying to sort of lead us to see the patterns and the ways that we think about God, and specifically the directions we look for God. And then it's trying to sort of turn us into a different direction to look for God. So here's what I mean. Can we pop back one slide here? There we go. So their first question after Jesus says, you're going to be baptized, they ask, Lord, are you now going to restore the kingdom of Israel? It's a dumb question. It's an understandable question, but it's a dumb question because Jesus never talked about restoring the kingdom of Israel. Like, I looked back at everything that's recorded in the Gospels about Jesus, and he never utters this phrase. And so these people have spent 3 years with Jesus. They watched him be crucified, and they thought the whole thing was over. Then they watched him be resurrected, and then they spent 40 days with him, and they're still asking the wrong question. Their paradigms are still off. It's also a dumb question for another reason, and I think it's meant to sort of be a dumb question, because the people who are reading this, the people who are reading the book of Acts, would have already known the answer to this. So Acts was probably written at like 80 AD, which is like 50 years after Jesus had peaced out. And the reason they knew that this question was off was because 10 years earlier, in 70 AD, people had tried to make the kingdom of Israel come back into power. And so they tried to take on Rome, who was over them at the time, and they got handily and readily defeated. Their temple, which was their sort of center for culture and life, was crushed. Jerusalem was not fully destroyed, but pretty roughed up. So the readers knew the answer to this question as they were looking at this. They knew that this wasn't what was going on. So why in the world did the author of Acts include it? Was he just trying to embarrass these people? I don't think so. I think what's going on here is he's trying to lead us into something deeper, to understand how we often look in the wrong places for God and for resurrection. And like I said, to turn us back in the direction. Here's what I mean. Their question is worded in a really interesting way. It says, Lord, when are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel? That word restore literally means to go back to the way things used to be. So when we're talking about directions of resurrection, Jesus' followers in this moment think that resurrection in God moves backwards. That if they could just get back to the way that things used to be, it would all be okay. That's what God was trying to do in the world. Pardon the sort of baggage with the phrase, but they were asking, are you going to make Israel great again? That is their framework. That if we can just get back to how things used to be, then that's the point of resurrection. That's what God has for us. And they're off. But before we get too critical of them, I think we have to realize that we often do the same thing today. It's 2,000 years later, and I don't know about you, but I often heard and even said in church quite a bit growing up, if we could just get back to the early church, if we could just get back to the Bible, if we could just get back to the way things used to be, if church was just like it was 5 years ago when all these people were here, and we just think if we can move back, then things will be okay. But that's not the direction that resurrection moves. Now here's the interesting thing about us trying to move backwards, trying to get back to the way things used to be. Our memories, the way that we think those things were, aren't actually true. Here's what I mean. Our memories are constructed. One day, Kaylin came home from class. She was in grad school studying psychology. And she says to me, I learned something really interesting today. All of our memories are constructions of our minds. Like, I think you joined a cult. I don't think that's psychology. She's like, no, it's actually like science. That the things that we remember, while they are based in something true, our mind puts them together in a certain way that we sort of want to. Which is the reason, if you pay attention to like forensic and criminal shows and news, eyewitness testimony isn't considered accurate anymore because we remember things the way that we want to remember them. So all that to say, when we talk about getting back to the way things used to be, when we think that resurrection and God moves backwards, we're just making it up in our heads. Those memories that we have are probably not even the way that things really were. And that's not at all how this resurrection, how God moves. Now, the really interesting thing in this story is that Jesus' response is really gracious and loving and powerful. So, if I were Jesus, and thank God I wasn't Jesus and I'm not Jesus, I would have been just so annoyed at this point. Because again, they had 3 years and then an extra 40 days post-death to experience Jesus, and they're still asking the wrong question. But instead of getting mad and angry and saying, you idiots, you got it wrong, Jesus sort of just gently turns them in the right direction. And he starts by saying, basically, it's none of your business. Like, just don't worry about that right now. But then he does something really interesting. He says, rather, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes. So they're asking for a certain type of power. They're asking for a power that has a political and imperial control. They want to be sitting on the throne again. And the word that Jesus uses is not that type of power. It has some like connotations for that, but the word that he uses is dynamis in the Greek, which you can hear kind of sounds like dynamic. So what he does is they're asking for a particular type of power, and he offers them a more dynamic type of power, something deeper than just political control, something deeper than a heavy hand. And what we find out that it is when we read ahead in Acts is it's the ability to see God in every circumstance, in every place on earth. Here's what I mean. He goes on and he says, you're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Now, that's like a geographical statement, obviously, and he's moving out, so they're in Jerusalem, and then he says Judea, which is a little farther out, Samaria is a little farther out. The ends of the earth are obviously very far out. So it's a geographical statement, but it's also a statement about holiness and where they think God is. I think I've mentioned this before, but people thought about God sort of geographically at the time. And so what he's trying to do is orient them outward to say, if you are looking for resurrection behind you, you actually need to look outward. And so it's a statement about holiness. Jerusalem was considered where God dwelled. That if you were in Jerusalem, you were in the presence of God. When you moved out of there and went to Judea, which is sort of like the state around Jerusalem, you were still like in the presence of God, but you weren't as close to the presence of God necessarily. By the time you got to Samaria, you were in some sort of sketchy territory. If you've read anything in scriptures about Samaria, it was, to put it just bluntly, in their minds, an area for sort of half-breeds, which is obviously a very mean way to put it. But it was people who were once Jewish, and then they sort of intermarried and sort of lost some of their status. And so Samaria was kind of sketchy. It was sort of holy, sort of not holy. And then by the time you got to the ends of the earth, you were definitely out of like God's territory. You were in the unholy part of the world. But what Jesus does, and what we find in the rest of Acts after this, is that in search of resurrection, in search of God, he turns his disciples outward, and they begin to realize that there is no holy and unholy. That God is in all of these places. That God can't be contained within our parameters, our religious parameters of what's holy. That God is actually surging and infused throughout all of this. He's reorienting their understanding of resurrection. Now, if that seems sort of too big a concept for us, then we kind of have a little bit of kind of easy direction here. So if you have a hard time thinking of the entire world being filled with God's presence, because there are some horrible things in the world, if Aleppo is too hard to imagine having the presence of God in it, then Jesus sort of suggests starting here. Start by looking for the presence of God in Napa, in your neighbor, and literally the person who lives next door to you. And look at them and say, how am I seeing the presence of God? Where is God in this? And then as we begin to do that, we can begin to see God in every situation, in every place. So if you've been frustrated spiritually, if you've sort of been disappointed by faith and religion at some point, it might be because it's trying to point and move backwards. It thinks that God is about moving backwards. But what we find here is that God is trying to point us outward into wider and wider circles of where God actually is. So I think that's the first direction that resurrection is moving in. There's a second direction, though, and it comes in the next part of the verse, if we can jump ahead. So the second part of this story is a really interesting and kind of almost hard to believe part of it. Jesus, after he says this, jumps on a cloud and surfs out of there, which is pretty great, right? If you're being honest, if I'm being honest, that's weird, right? You don't see that happen very often, or I've never seen that happen. If you've seen that happen, please raise your hand and tell us right now, because that sounds pretty cool. And if you're having a hard time finding it believable, if it seems sort of irrational to you, I think that's okay. Because I think when we see something that seems kind of irrational in Scripture, what it's trying to do is lead us into something deeper. Because the point of this isn't that we literally think that Jesus pieced out and surfed out on some clouds. Whether or not that happened is kind of up for debate. But what is actually happening in the story and what's going on is, again, the story and Jesus and God, I think, are trying to reorient how we think about God and resurrection, trying to turn us in a different direction. Here's what I mean. This story of Jesus ascending out of earth is working with a preconceived notion of how the world worked. And then it eventually will sort of subvert it. So here's what I mean. I think Pete has talked about this before, but at this time and sort of before this, people viewed the world as having 3 tiers, 3 levels, so to speak. Because they didn't know much about space or what was beyond us. It was before Galileo and Copernicus and all these scientific discoveries. They thought that God literally dwelled up above us. And so it made sense at the time. You didn't know what was above you. And the only thing that came from above was weather, was rain, which you needed to survive. So it was sort of this life-giving stuff was coming from above us. So therefore, that must be where God or multiple gods dwelled. So that was sort of the first and the top tier. There's a second tier, which is just earth. It's where we live, and it's sort of where we dwell, and it's the tier that we know. Then there was a bottom tier. And that bottom tier, in Hebrew, is called Sheol. In other cultures, it was just sort of called the underworld. And it wasn't necessarily hell or heaven. It was just where you went when you died. And it made sense, too, because when you bury a body, that's where you put it. You put it underground. And so they thought of the world this way, that there was an inherent separation between our tier, our level, and where God dwells. So that God is distant from us. God is not present with us. And it's interesting, Jesus sort of plays into that for a second by ascending into heaven. So he works with their preconceived notion, but then he subverts it. He reorients it. He changes it. Because if you keep reading on in Acts past this passage, what they find is that God is not up somewhere else, but they begin to experience God in themselves and around them. As they move out into those places that were considered less and less holy, where God wasn't supposed to be, all of a sudden they realized God is there. God is present there. God is not above us, somewhere distant. God is all around us. So if you've been frustrated with this sort of direction of spirituality, of looking up, it's because oftentimes we think that God is removed from us. We ask ourselves questions like, where was God when blank? Or why isn't God doing anything in this situation? And what we're assuming is that God is somewhere else, that God is not already here infused in the world around us. Now, the disciples get a really interesting response. They are sitting there staring upward, which is totally understandable because, again, you don't see someone just go up into the clouds very often. And they get sort of chastised for it by a couple like angelic beings or people in white robes, maybe just people fresh out the shower, I don't know. And they say, why are you looking up? They just got a horizontal command. They were just told to go out into the world to experience the presence of God, but they're still thinking about God vertically. They're still staring up, waiting for God to do something. And what this story is doing is trying to get us to stop looking up for God and to start looking around us for God. This is where it's really helpful to think about God as ground of being, which I know Pete has talked about before. That God is not some bearded person floating up in the sky somewhere, turning knobs and changing things. But God is actually the force of love and energy that is surging throughout our world. And just like an electrical current, we have the ability in each situation, in each place that we go, to tap into that. To experience, even in the darkest situations, the presence of God. And so the story is trying to get us to not look up, to not look back for resurrection, but to look out, to look in the here and now, so that wherever you are at, in church, outside of church, in work, God is there and God is accessible. And this is what the mystics have been saying for years. This isn't a new concept. This has been sort of a vein throughout the history of both Christian thought and non-Christian thought. This is what Richard Rohr calls the cosmic Christ. That Christ was more than just a figure. Christ is actually how God moves throughout the world. It's the presence of God surging throughout our world. And so what I think this story is doing is asking us to wake up to that. To realize that God's not back there. That we don't have to get back to God. We don't have to ask God to get down here to intervene. But God is available right here, right now, in the everyday life that we are living. If we just open ourselves to that. So I hope that you can do that. I hope that as you go from here, whatever it may be, whatever you're doing, you can realize that that moment is as holy as Jerusalem was 2,000 years ago, that there is no sacred and secular. There are no places that you can go that the presence of God isn't already infused with. So I hope you do that this week. The band's going to come up here for one last song, and I'm going to pray. And then we'll wrap up, and you can be on your way. So, will you pray with me? God, we thank you that you work within our preconceived and oftentimes broken or shortcoming conventions of who you are and how you work and how life is. I pray that when we look for you, when we look for resurrection, when we begin to try to find life, if we might not look back, we might not look up, we might look around us, that we might see in each person that we come in contact with your presence of love, the healing that you're trying to move towards. And we might have the faith and the ability to step into that and to walk into that. In your name, amen.